Terrorism here at the Center for Security Policy, and we're really excited today to bring you this panel where we'll be talking about the Southern Poverty Law Center with the author of a great new book. It's called Making Hate Pay: The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center, with Tyler O'Neill. Tyler is a senior editor of PJ Media. He's an author and conservative commentator, and he's written for a number of publications, including the National Review, the Christian Post, the Washington Free Beacon, and many others. And we're really excited to talk to him today about his new book. Joining us will be General William Jerry Boykin. General Boykin serves as Family Research Council's Executive Vice President. He's a 36-year veteran of the U.S. Army and was one of the original members of the U.S. Army Delta Force. Importantly, on August 15th, 2012, the Family Research Center was attacked by a man named Floyd Lee Corkins, who shot and wounded a security guard before being subdued. And Corkins later told investigators he targeted the group because it was on the hate group list of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we've asked General Boykin to participate today and respond a little bit to what he hears, and maybe we can talk a little bit about how we should move forward. So without much further ado, I want to turn it over to Tyler just to talk a little bit about his findings in the book and what he's learned about the Southern Poverty Law Center. Tyler, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kyle. So my book covers the corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I think this is a very important topic because throughout the past year, the Southern Poverty Law Center has been hanging under this cloud of a racial discrimination and sexual harassment scandal that has, it led to the firing of its co-founder, Morris Dees. It led to the resignations of its president, Richard Cohen, and another key legal advisor at the Southern Poverty Law Center. But they came in and said, look, we're going to have an internal review. And they brought in Michelle Obama's former chief of staff, Tina Chen, to run the review. And we haven't heard anything. It's been almost exactly a year. And they're about to come out with their annual list of hate groups that has been very thoroughly debunked. Right after the big scandal broke, former employees of the SPLC came forward and said that they had been part of the con. They were complicit in bilking their donors and exaggerating hate. This coming from the very liberal former employees at the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the Southern Poverty Law Center has for decades used its hate group accusation to smear conservative and Christian organizations. It has a very biased angle to it, and it's quite a terrifying black mark on someone's record, because when the Southern Poverty Law Center labels you a hate group, they're essentially associating you with the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacist terrorism. And actually just 2 months ago, they testified before Congress about the threat of white supremacist terrorism. And while doing so, they said, this hate group list is statistical evidence that the threat of white supremacist terrorism is increasing across the United States. Never mind that most of their groups aren't even accused of racism, much less white supremacy. You have, upstanding organizations like the Center for Security Policy and the Family Research Council on the list. Center for Security Policy is smeared as an anti-Muslim hate group, and the Family Research Council is smeared as an anti-LGBT hate group. But the fact of the matter is, the Center for Security Policy focuses on security policy, and you have had many employees, current and former, with the Trump administration serving in government, helping to defend America. And the Family Research Council has published a lot of research defending pro-family ideas and statements and explaining why the traditional nuclear family is an important resource for American society. Both of these organizations have nothing to do with terrorism or white supremacy. But the Southern Poverty Law Center continues over and over to say, look, these are our hate groups. These are the groups that are fomenting hatred and leading America to be a more violent place. And the great irony of it is that their own accusation has led to a terrorist attack, or an attempted terrorist attack, Thank God it was foiled by the security guard, Leo Johnson, who stood in the way of this shooter at the Family Research Council. But my book focuses on how the SPLC got here. We have this organization that has weaponized its history to smear conservative and Christian groups and equate them with the Ku Klux Klan. And they've gotten Amazon to blacklist organizations on their list. They've gotten Hyatt hotels. They've gotten credit card companies like Discover and MasterCard to no longer work with organizations on the list. And it's this huge black mark. And in some cases, in Michigan, you had the Attorney General start a hate crimes unit focused on SPLC accused hate groups. So how did the SPLC get here, and why is it taken seriously? It's taken seriously because it really did start as a noble civil rights organization. You had this guy, Morris Dees, who's the co-founder over there, and he wanted to set things right. He had grown up in the South. He had witnessed the civil rights struggles. He himself had, decided it was more important for him to make money than it was to get involved in the civil rights movement. But he eventually decided, he got religion. He said, I want to go and do civil rights work. He got the first black representatives elected in Alabama since Reconstruction. He got innocent people off of death row. The first few years of the Southern Poverty Law Center are nothing but a story of a noble organization fighting for people who need to be represented. But eventually, Morris Dees decided that he was more focused on fighting the Ku Klux Klan than on helping poor people. And there are some really telling moments in my book where he says, look, if you want to help these poor people in the South, go find some do-good lawyers to do that. We're focused on fighting the Klan. And, fighting the Klan is, to some degree, a noble pursuit. The Ku Klux Klan is a horrible, horrific hate group in the United States, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands. And it's important to recognize the good work that the Southern Poverty Law Center did. But Morris Dees decided, we're not focused on helping poor people, we're fighting the Klan. They beat the Klan. Former staffers actually quit from the SPLC because they were beating the Klan so easily and not helping poor people in the South. And then he decided, well, we've got a good thing going. We've beat the Klan. Let's go after more and more organizations. And eventually, it grew to be ever more mainstream conservative and Christian groups on the list. And the Southern Poverty Law Center raked in the cash by going after these organizations. I mean, when they were suing the Klan, they raked in millions. But then when they said that there are 1,000 hate groups in the United States, they raked in cash. And when it came to Charlottesville, the white nationalist riots there, they had been working on attacking Confederate monuments for years. And so when that outbreak of violence happened, violence that we saw from both the right and the left, the SPLC came forward and said, we are the centerpiece. If you want to fight hate, fund us. And Apple chipped in $1 million. J.P. Morgan chipped in $500,000. And CNN decided to share the hate map, the very map that had led to the attack on the Family Research Council, on their Twitter, on their website. Like they said, look, we're effectively endorsing this. So this organization reached almost a zenith then. And they're continually pushing, today they're going to come out with another report on how donor-advised funds can cut off hate groups by saying that hate, by which they mean conservative and Christian organizations, is not charitable and needs to be cut off from the sphere of polite society. This is a very dangerous organization. They're taken far too seriously than they deserve, and they have this humongous scandal that no one is talking about. So it's important for us to hold their feet to the fire and explain why this organization is not the credible, hate clearinghouse that it claims to be.
I think this is a good time to bring in General Boykin. General, obviously, we mentioned that hate map, and we also mentioned, the impact that it had on your group. Tell us a little bit about the difficulties you've had with the Southern Poverty Law Center, how you view the issue, and maybe some things you've been thinking about what we can do to try to address this issue.
Yeah, thanks. Look, we at the Family Research Council, I think, are the sterling example of what happens when you recklessly go around slandering people and organizations with the label of haters. We were listed some time ago, years ago, as a hate group because we took a stand on what we considered to be natural biblical marriage, and that is that marriage between one man and one woman. Therefore, Floyd Lee Corkins, who came in our building on the 15th of August at 10:41 in the morning, 2012, and shot our building manager, Leo Johnson, as you just said earlier. That man told the judge that he targeted us to kill as many people as possible, and he was going to smear a Chick-fil-A sandwich in each face of the dead that he killed, because we were a hate group. We hated homosexuals. Let me look at you that are watching this or that will see this later. That is not true. Nothing could be further from the truth. We are a faith-based organization, and we do not hate people, regardless of who they are or what they've done. Now, that said, I will tell you that this whole hate map thing is totally illegitimate. What gives a self-proclaimed arbiter of hate the authority to list people and organizations as haters? What gives them that authority? The only thing that gives them that authority is when industry and government use that data as if it was authentic. It is not authentic. I could do the same thing. I could do the same thing. Any organization could do the same thing. Any individual could do the same thing and develop their own hate map. This is all about making money. First of all, it's all about making money, and secondly, it's all about supporting the agenda of the left extremist organizations in America. And you can read that as all of those that you see represented today in many ways on the stage at the debates. The leftists are what they are trying to do now is push the leftist agenda. There's no legitimacy to these hate maps. In fact, they've listed people like, excuse me, they've listed people like Ben Carson on the hate map as a hater. Now they've also paid for it because they've had at least one lawsuit that they settled out of court for $3.75 million because it was totally illegitimate, and they recognize that. And as you said, Tyler, their own people are coming out against them now. Their own people are unionizing now, and by the way, do you know this? They have fought back against their people unionizing, but for years they've been on the side of the unions. All of a sudden, when their own people are saying, no, you've been exploiting us, you've been paying us slave wages in the state of Alabama, and now we're going to form a union and we're going to do negotiations, we're going to do collective bargaining. Now all of a sudden, SPLC is against the unions. Think about that. Morris Dees made millions of dollars in direct mail before he started the Southern Poverty Law Center. He made millions of dollars, and think of this was back in the 60s, and he made millions of dollars before he went into the Southern Poverty Law Center development and expansion. But then, when he got into this, he realized that this was also a money-making operation, and that is what they've been doing, and their own people have said, we were part of it. We were part of this money-making, and we were led down, basically, down a primrose path. And now we realize what we've been part of, and they're rising up and they're coming out, and that's why Morris Dees and Cohen and Heidi Byrick, who does this hate map, why all of these people have been forced out of Southern Poverty Law Centers, because their own people have now come out against them. You see, the only thing that gives them legitimacy, and I'm going to say this again, is when big corporations and government use their data. And what we need to do now is we need to, every time a company uses their data, or a government organization using that data, we need to come right back at them with a message that you are using data from an organization that their own people have said are racist and sexist. And all you have to do is go back and read the transcripts of Morris D.'s divorce. And what you will find is that this should be no surprise whatsoever, because it's almost pornographic as his ex-wife describes all of the aberrant behavior that this man was into. And I've got to tell you, that aberrant behavior transferred over to the Southern Poverty Law Center and existed there for decades.
You know,
Until his people finally came out against him.
I think that raises a really good question, and I'll ask some questions and we'll try to start a little bit of a conversation here. And Tyler, this one is sort of for you. One of the things that struck me about your book was the excellent sourcing. I mean, you go way back to the very beginning of the SPLC and their founding, and you know, looked at their questionable tactics and how they conflate and exaggerate threats. And what struck me was a lot of this behavior was in fact not a secret. There were local press reports. There were even reporting, you know, from leftist publications and left-leaning publications saying, you know, there's a serious problem at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Why do you think, that this information, although available, people just don't recognize it?
Well, I think, you know, we see something very similar with the New York Times, the Washington Post, you know, governments following and echoing the Southern Poverty Law Center even after this, you know, racism and sexism scandal broke. You have a very big incentive that the liberal groups have to, you know, groups have an incentive to cite the Southern Poverty Law Center as a reliable source, to overlook its own corruption, to overlook the corruption of its founder, and to say, look, this is an effective tool. It's a weapon. It's a political weapon against groups like the Center for Security Policy, groups like the Family Research Council. They like to have this hate group label that they can reference, even though, you know, as you said, Morris D.'s divorce filings, and some of the stuff like he was sleeping with women who were applying to work at the Southern Poverty Law Center. These are huge Me Too no-nos. And you have this culture of sexual availability for Morris D.'s at this organization that he co-founded that's really troubling on all sorts of levels. And you have groups, you know, outlets like the New York Times that will just cite the SPLC as this perfect source without acknowledging any of the scandals and the fact that they fired their co-founder, you know, the fact that this is a corrupt organization. We have to get out there and continue to make the case. But it's too politically useful for a lot of people on the left to acknowledge that the SPLC is a corrupt organization, that it has all these money in Cayman Island accounts. You know, a nonprofit civil rights group with funds in the Cayman Islands, millions of dollars. It boggles the mind. And yet there's such a useful organization for the left, for liberal, you know, for Democrats. You had, and I don't know if you guys saw this, a comparison to Pol Pot was made. Alliance Defending Freedom was compared to the Cambodian dictator Pol Pot on the floor of the Senate when Senator Al Franken, you know, the great, majestic Senator Al Franken, came up and was engaging in another attack against conservatives. And it's a very useful label, this hate group accusation. And I think that's the reason. They have every incentive to notice and to echo the SPLC and no incentive to really delve into it. And we have to hold their feet to the fire.
I think that raises another really good point, which I wanted to get into, which is, and General Boykin raised this a little bit, which is that when you have the reliance of major corporations, of the mainstream media, and then of course elements of the government relying on the Southern Poverty Law Center, it's very legitimating for them. So Tyler, I was wondering if you could just walk us through very quickly sort of what the status is of the relationships between the sort of elements. So starting first with the government, where is the law enforcement and government relationship with the SPLC right now? And I've seen articles saying that various elements of the government have cut off relationships with the SPLC, and then you sort of see stuff that suggests maybe they haven't. Do you have a sense of where that is right now on the government side?
So this is one of the times when I can very much say thank God for Donald Trump and thank God for Jeff Sessions. They stood very firmly and said, Jeff Sessions spoke at an Alliance Defending Freedom conference and said, the FBI will not work with discredited organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the tragic thing is we have had government law enforcement apparatuses work with the Southern Poverty Law Center for years. In, I think it was 2003, the military was giving out a right-wing extremism pamphlet that talked about SPLC hate groups. And, just during the debates, the great Democratic moderate, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., came out and said he wanted a Southern Poverty Law Center style, terrorist watch list for organizations that were accused of fomenting hate and violence against LGBT people. So this is, right now, the federal government has mostly distanced itself. I'm sure there might be some local and state, and we have seen local and state, in Michigan, Attorney General Dana Nessel went right out and created a hate crimes unit using SPLC data, citing it, saying, look, we have this many hate groups in Michigan. The Southern Poverty Law Center says so. Therefore, we need to monitor hate crimes, and I'm starting this branch of government to do that. Thankfully, there are 2 legal challenges to her new policy. And the guy that she started the new policy with actually resigned shortly afterward because he had said some very offensive things about women, which just kind of makes you scratch your head and be like, okay, the Me Too movement has done a lot of damage against the SPLC. Thank God, not enough, but
yeah, the element of hypocrisy is hard to ignore in this whole thing. And General Boykin, I thought if I could get your views on this as well, because obviously you were in the Pentagon as an undersecretary for intelligence. You know a thing or two about intelligence reporting, both consuming it and also creating it. And one of the concerns I have, I think, is that a law enforcement agency or a government agency will often, if it's the only sourcing available, they will take it. And my question is one of our challenges the fact that there is no legitimate organization actually looking into some of these issues, and so the law enforcement agencies say, well, the SPLC are the only people talking about white supremacy, so they're the only game in town. Do you think that's a legitimate concern, and how would you address that?
I don't. And I don't because the FBI tracks this kind of stuff. And in many ways, the local and state law enforcement track these kinds of things. And here's the problem, going back to what Tyler said. At the same time that the Southern Poverty Law Center says the hate crimes are going up, the FBI says no, they're actually decreasing.
Mm-hmm.
And who do you think most of the hate crimes are against? Muslims? No. They're against Jews. You'll never see anything on the part of the Southern Poverty Law Center that is supportive of the Jews or Israel. In fact, it's just the opposite. We did an entire study at Family Research Council on anti-Semitism by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And we show you how they support Students for Justice in Palestine on college campuses and all, which is a very anti-Semitic organization.
Mm-hmm.
They support them, and then they turn around and criticize Christian organizations that support Israel or some Jewish organizations. Now that said, it's also, I think, very important for us to understand that it's not only this anti-Semitism that you see in this organization, and don't give me this stuff that, Dees is Jewish or Cohen is Jewish. There are lots of anti-Semitic Jews in America, and this organization was headed by a couple of them from what we see of their actions and their words. But that said, you know who they don't list on their hate map? They don't list any of these groups that call for the killing of police. They don't list Antifa.
Mm-hmm.
They don't list Black Lives Matter. Now let me see. Black Lives Matters. What do we want? Dead cops. When do we want them? Now. That was Black Lives Matter. But they're not listed. They're advocating the killing of police. How about Antifa? Same thing. They're advocating violent revolution. They're not listed on that hate map. So the question is why? And the answer is because they're in the same camp as the Southern Poverty Law Center. That's what Southern Poverty Law Center is focused on now, is pushing the agenda of these anti-Semitic organizations that are also revolutionary, like Antifa, in terms of violent overthrow, because we have actually a conservative president that is the most pro-life president we've ever had, and it is supporting religious liberty at a level that no previous president has, and therefore they have come out against those groups, but said absolutely nothing about these groups that are threatening not only law enforcement, but threatening conservative groups like us.
When the SPLC is actually sending information to Antifa, they're working through, and there was this woman who bragged about it, who I reference in the book, who's saying, look, I work closely with anti-fascist groups, and I work closely with the Southern Poverty Law Center. I send them information. And up in Canada, there's a Southern Poverty Law Center analog that actually got funding from the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. They have worked directly with Antifa in Canada. So the SPLC seems to be a little bit smarter than that here in the States, but it's very revealing up there. And you talk about the anti-Semitism angle. I remember last year the Southern Poverty Law Center had a document warning against Holocaust denial, which, it's a good thing. We need to warn against it. They mentioned Muslims twice and Jews only once, and they said that Holocaust denial might threaten Muslims, totally overlooking the fact that the number one place for Holocaust denial is the Middle East. It's a tragic fact. And I think a lot of American Muslims, I have M. Zudi Jasser referenced in the book, Majid Nawaz. There are great Muslim reformers who stand against all the problems that Islam has across the world.
Right, and of course, Nawaz is the very individual that won that suit against the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Well, they settled out of court.
Yeah.
They never went to trial with it, but it was very clear that this was, in fact, clear discrimination. And he won in out-of-court settlement.
Right, and that gets to sort of the interesting thing about the Southern Poverty Law Center and the way they treat their list. You mentioned, testifying before Congress saying that this is statistical evidence and so on. And then, of course, when the lawsuits come about, and you mentioned a number of lawsuits in the book, when the lawsuits come about, they go back and say, well, what defines a hate group? Nobody really knows. It's just sort of an opinion, and opinions are not covered by libel and slander laws, and therefore you can't sue us. And so they definitely sort of have this game where they get it both ways, and it's sort of fortunate, I think, that we're starting to see us turn the corner on some groups calling them out on that and saying, well, you're telling people that this is a factual list and that your designation of somebody as a hate group is a fact. Well, then you're liable for these things, and I think that's very positive. Going back to the question of the SPLC's position in society and their ability to work with various groups, I was wondering, Tyler, if you could talk a little bit about their relationship with Silicon Valley and especially the tech companies. General Boykin briefly mentioned, I think, Amazon. You mentioned Apple. Talk to me a little bit about what that looks like and the influence that they gain because of that.
Yeah, there is a very large documented liberal bias among these Silicon Valley tech companies. And it's fine to have your political opinions, but when you have these echo chambers that control platforms that, expand across the country and across the world, you're getting into a little bit of a dangerous territory, especially when these organizations trust the Southern Poverty Law Center. So, as we mentioned, Amazon has decided to cut organizations. Anybody branded a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center is automatically excluded from the Amazon Smile charity program. Then there was some discussion of Twitter trusting the SPLC, and I think they've mostly distanced themselves. Facebook has mostly distanced themselves, but Google has, YouTube considers the SPLC a trusted flagger, and you have the lawsuits right now from PragerU against YouTube for their discrimination against conservative views, and you have a lawsuit with D. James Kennedy Ministries against Amazon, and of course the fact that Apple decided to give $1 million to the SPLC and then launch a program so that anybody who uses an iPhone can automatically give to the SPLC. They're setting up these pathways to give the SPLC more money and more influence. And these are things that they need to be called out for. I think both big tech and American, corporate America in general, are giving the SPLC far too much credit and too much credibility in the way that they fight hate. And this is the tragic thing of the whole situation, is that a lot of these tech companies want to do what they can against white supremacy. And they believe what the SPLC says about white supremacy. And the problem is, the SPLC is exaggerating things. We know from their own staffers that they're doing this. And the SPLC is lumping everybody in as part of this white supremacist threat because they know it's effective to bilk, Silicon Valley into going after their political opponents. And we need to acknowledge Silicon Valley has, some good concerns about some of these organizations. Some of, the Ku Klux Klan doesn't really exist anymore, but there are organizations pushing white nationalism. And, a lot of them have rights under the Constitution that need to be defended. And one of the problems with the SPLC's push is that they're attacking people's right to associate. But should far extreme organizations have a platform with tech companies? That's a good question, and tech companies need to figure it out. But they trust the Southern Poverty Law Center, and that broadens the issue tremendously. So now you have mainstream conservative and Christian organizations being lumped in with white nationalist groups. And so when the when big tech decides to deplatform and actually, take away the website hosting for white supremacist websites like I can't remember what it was called, but there was it Stormfront? Yeah.
Daily Stormer, I think.
Oh, Daily Stormer, yes.
Yeah.
The Daily Stormer got removed, and it's like, okay, well, maybe they have some rights under the Constitution. How do we figure this out? But organizations should be able to say they won't work with them. But the difficulty is they look at Stormfront and say, okay, they're a hate group. The Southern Poverty Law Center says so. Who else do the Southern Poverty Law Center say is a hate group? And they went after Jihad Watch. And, conservative websites that warn against radical Islamic terrorism have gotten these terrifying emails where, somebody from ProPublica says, we're working with Google. We noticed that you get a lot of ad space. You get a lot of money selling ads for this company, this company, this company. Google AdWords is working with you. How would it affect you if you lost all these things? It's like my managing editor, Paula Bolliard, says, nice website there. Pity if something were to happen to it.
And I think it's interesting because you mentioned and that they've been very effective on this. And one of the things that, early on in the struggle with the Islamic State, the U.S. government and other world governments were going to the tech companies and they were saying, we're struggling with this challenge of jihadist propaganda. It's on most of the social media sites. We had problems on Facebook and Twitter and some of the smaller ones like Telegram and what have you. And they said, will you please help us address this? And they did a terrible job. They were very ineffective at addressing Islamic State propaganda or Al-Qaeda propaganda. And yet they seem to be very motivated and very very successful when it comes to, both the SPLC type groups, the white supremacist groups, but then the other people who are maligned, the Alliances Defending Freedoms, the Family Research Council. Why is it so hard to take the Islamic State off of Twitter, but it's not so hard to take, a group designated by the SPLC? And that always struck me as their level of enthusiasm for policing their platform did not seem to me to be balanced. And then the last thing, getting into platforms and publishing, talk to me a little bit about the relationship between the SPLC and sort of the media. What does that relationship look like? How far back does it go? How did they address the scandal? And then what do you see going forward?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest illustrations of the SPLC and the media working together was last October when Act for America came out and said, we're going to host a gala at Mar-a-Lago. And, this is a natural fit, Trump's hotel, with an organization that very firmly supports Trump's national security policies. And, the New York Times, the Miami Herald, and the Tampa Bay Times all immediately ran articles. It was like within a few hours where the SPLC and the Council on American Islamic Relations published a statement saying, how dare Mar-a-Lago host these groups? How dare Mar-a-Lago host Act for America? They're a hate group. We've got to get them off immediately. And then the media echo chamber leaps into it like that. And, the New York Times, the Palm Beach Post, the Miami Herald, these are newspapers of record in Florida and the United States. And they pretty much ran exactly the story from CARE and the SPLC. And I think they might have had maybe half a sentence saying, oh, the SPLC has, these labels have been contested in the past. Nothing on the SPLC's scandal, that had happened 6 months before where they fired their co-founder for racism and sexism. Nothing about that. Just, we're going to echo their talking points almost verbatim. And Mar-a-Lago caved. And then the interesting thing was, Mar-a-Lago is also going to host a Center for Security Policy event that actually did happen, thank God. And the CARE and the SPLC did it again, and the New York Times and the Palm Beach Post and the Miami Herald did it again. And they were saying, oh, the Center for Security Policy, this horrible hate group, is being hosted by Mar-a-Lago. Mar-a-Lago should cancel immediately. To their credit, the Trump organization did not cancel the event. But it's very interesting that, the Center for Security Policy has this push against anti-Semitism. And in all the stories, they reached out to, I believe it was you, Fred, for comment. And they spoke with, yeah. Did you want to?
I just wanted to, this is Fred White from the Center for Security Policy. Thank you, Tyler, for coming. Yes, the center was also targeted by the Southern Poverty Law Center and CARE with these false attacks being on these hate lists, but our dinner wasn't canceled because we fought back aggressively. Set the record straight. We went after every journalist who ran these fake stories. I'm very grateful to you, Tyler, for the accurate reporting that you did on this event in Pajamas Media. We individually went after every reporter who was writing this fake news. We went after their editors, and I'm very grateful to the Trump Organization for not. And while I have the microphone, I want to ask a question. Any of you can answer it. And that's about Aya Hirsi Ali. She was placed on the Southern Poverty Law Center hate list, which I think is one of the most absurd and outrageous things this organization has ever done. Could you talk about her and why this is so outrageous?
Yeah, so Aya Hirsi Ali is, she's a former Muslim who grew up in an Islamic country and was oppressed. She suffered female genital mutilation. She suffered for speaking out against some of these practices. I believe she was imprisoned and she was tortured. And she is one of the great human rights figures of our time. We really, and to have the Southern Poverty Law Center go after her is beyond the pale. Because here's a woman who experienced horrific tortures, and she's speaking out against the threats that radical Islam poses and why radical Islam led to the tortures of her. And look, Islam is a diverse religion. There are a lot of great reformers that we need to stand with, and we are standing.
And we shouldn't be putting them on hate lists.
Exactly.
That's the thing that's so disconcerting, is that you have a list of hate, and you're going to put on people that are taking on jihadists, they're taking on Islamist groups, and the SPLC has made common cause with groups. We mentioned Council on American Islamic Relations many times. Of course, CARE and multiple employees from CARE have direct terror ties, and that's historically been shown by the U.S. government. And you mentioned the FBI not working with the SPLC anymore. The FBI refuses to work with CARE anymore because of those relationships. But and so you have them literally using their hate list at the Southern Poverty Law Center against people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who are literally fighting hate. And it's not too much to call it Kafkaesque, I think. General, you have thoughts on that, and just the way that the Southern Poverty Law Center advances its designations until they literally make no sense. And then I think we'll go to a question or two in the audience if we have some.
I'll just say that the history of the Southern Poverty Law Center is such that they never go after these radical Islamic groups. Never. Now, they'll list some Islamic group that you've never heard of as being a hate group. But you actually go look at CARE, ISNA, ICNA, all of those major Islamic groups that were listed on the unindicted co-conspirator list from the 2008 Holy Land Foundation trial. And there, as far as I know, there is not a single one of those unindicted co-conspirators that's listed on that hate list. Let me say one thing about what you were talking about earlier, Tyler, and that was the big tech. Well, there's another organization that Southern Poverty Law Center is working through, and multiple organizations, and that's these charity navigators. Mm-hmm. And what their latest tactic is, and they've been doing this for probably 4 or 5 years now, is they push that data on these organizations that provide funding to different organizations, different groups and so forth, like 501c3 organizations in particular. And they push the data on them, and then all of a sudden you're getting nothing from them. We've experienced this. We fought back on it and won it, but we have our funding cut off, so in many cases it's people that want to make a donation to us. They go through this, or they give you an evaluation and a rating so people that want to give to charitable organizations can see how credible you are. And they give them all this data that discredits us, and then people shut off money, and that's been part of their game plan here. So not only are they making a bunch of money, they got almost $500 million now in their coffers. About $500 million in the time.
In their endowment, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's not only that, but it's also the fact that they're using that contrived, illegitimate data to shut off funding for the rest of us, just like you were talking about earlier, Fred.
Thank you. All right, we'll go to the audience.
Dan Pollack from the Zionist Organization of America.
Hey, Dan, thanks for coming.
Following up on what the General just mentioned, I think there's 2 categories of opposition here and people using the SPLC. The New York Times is probably doing it out of ideological sympathy and purpose. But the other big factor is laziness in the media. And I think the vast majority, probably including these charity organizations, aren't doing it out of a particular animus, but that it's so easy for them. And so therefore a tactic suggests itself. And I wanted all 3 of your comments on this tactic. Is there a way to take advantage of the laziness of reporters to provide lists, maybe a consortium of conservative groups, to provide lists of disreputable organizations, including CARE, and every time I hear NIAC mentioned on a radio station or TV station or interview, I go ballistic for the same reason. It's the entire history of the organization. That's the Iranian-American group that has close ties to the regime in Iran. But it happens all the time. CARE is mentioned without giving its actual history that the General just mentioned. So is the Southern Poverty Law Center. There's a whole group of those. And so maybe we ought to, I want all of you to respond about what is it that we can do to take advantage of this fundamental laziness of so many in the media.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I just, and one of the great ironies here is that, a lot of the center's work has been documenting these groups and their behaviors, their ties to foreign groups, and frankly, some of the appalling hatred that comes out of them, anti-LGBT statements, anti-women, racist statements that come out of some of these groups. And for that very act of keeping track of these sorts of bad behavior from these groups is the reason why we are on the SPLC list and why we often take a great deal of flack from the media. And so there is definitely a double standard in terms of the very performance of the idea of keeping track of groups that engage in hateful behavior, where it's lauded when it's done by the SPLC. But if conservative groups raise questions about some of the other groups that are not on the SPLC lists, that's considered unacceptable. So I think you raise an interesting point that I would suggest has been preempted by the very fact that they don't consider this sort of political behavior of looking into groups and their hateful statements as acceptable when it comes from the right.
Well, I think the short answer is yes, but the more drawn out answer is a lot more difficult. We don't want to come out with our own hate group list that suggests about the SPLC what the SPLC suggests about us, because it's fundamentally deceptive. It's like
And fundamentally, we're for free speech.
Across this, yeah, a lot of times there's this talking point that a lot of people that I very much admire say, and they come out and they say that the Southern Poverty Law Center is a hate group, and I'm like, I respond, no, it's not. Hate group means something. We have to hold the Southern Poverty Law Center to account that when they say somebody's a hate group, they're associating them with the Ku Klux Klan. They mean to do this over and over and over again. We have their public statements. We are not going to say that the Southern Poverty Law Center is a hate group in that same way. However, they are a group that really should not be trusted. They're a group that is spreading animus. They're a group that is, twisting the facts against their political opponents. And they're clearly engaging in deceptive tactics. So if we come out with a list of disreputable liberal organizations, and I think that's a great idea. I think we should have a coalition come together so that it can't be ignored. One of the difficult things is that it often is ignored, as the Center has shown time and time again, and as unfortunately we've seen recently with the statements against the Equality Act on Capitol Hill. You have this broad coalition of lesbian feminists joining with pro-lifers, joining with religious freedom people, all saying, look, the Equality Act is a bad deal, and they don't get any media coverage. So I think holding groups' feet to the fire and consistently coming out with a message is clear. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, was because I think the Southern Poverty Law Center is the headwaters of this. But you're very right in saying that NIAC, in saying that CARE, these organizations are in a similar situation, that are given credibility that is not due them, and we should have some way of fighting back. What that exactly will look like.
I think we have time for one more question, so we'll squeeze this one in here. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Mike Waller at the Center for Security Policy. Thank you, Tyler, for this great book you've mapped out. I've got a question, though, for General Boykin. It concerns how a lot of news and information groups unquestionably accept SPLC as authoritative, but the big important one is Wikipedia. which is supposedly free for anybody in the world to edit, yet it seems like the SPLC has a lock on Wikipedia and has damaged a lot of our organizations. Can you comment on your own experiences? And maybe, Tyler, you're nodding your head, you might have something to say as well.
Well, I can tell you just from personal experience, before I even became part of Family Research Council. Bad slip there. But I read stuff on Wikipedia about me that I don't know where they got it from, because nothing could be further from the truth. But I later discovered that a lot of that was coming from the Southern Poverty Law Center. A lot of that was being given to Wikipedia or was being posted. So we decided we were going to go back and start eliminating stuff that was said about Family Research Council, about me, about Tony Perkins and all that. And the process you have to go through to be able to post something or eliminate something from that, for us, the conservatives, the people that have propaganda on our pages, is a very difficult process to navigate and get through, and we have yet to succeed. But the Southern Poverty Law Center can populate that website, can change that information at the drop of a hat. There is a liberal bias there that is so obvious. Let me say this too, going back to kind of what both of you are talking about though. One of the things that got very little public expression after Steve Scalise was shot was the fact that the guy that shot him was also, like Floyd Lee Corkins that shot our building manager, he was going to the Southern Poverty Law Center website too. And so the question is, how much influence did that have on him? Was it the same level that it had on Floyd Lee Corkins that came in our building? And this is dangerous, and I couldn't agree more with what Tyler said. If we start our own hate list, all we're doing is legitimizing their authority to start a hate list and to promulgate this hate list. That is not what we should be doing. We shouldn't, and I've been asked repeatedly, can we start a hate list? Should we start a hate list? My answer is always no. We're legitimizing their actions. We're saying on the one hand, they have no legitimacy whatsoever, and then on the other hand, we're turning around and doing exactly the same thing, and it doesn't comport. So we can't do that.
When we talk about Wikipedia, it's a very interesting model because they claim that anybody can edit it, and to some degree that is true. But there are editors who watch a specific page like a hawk, and as soon as you change something, they're in there immediately changing it back. We saw this. They won a Censor of the Year award from Reasons to Believe, which is it wasn't Reasons to Believe, it was another one of these intelligent design groups, because they have a page on intelligent design calling it pseudoscience. They kept taking the pseudoscience down because, on your page explaining what you are, that kind of thing is very much an attack and not legitimate to have at the top. But there's an editor, and I don't know who this person is, but they're watching it like a hawk, and they will make sure that you can't remove it. So I think there's probably a team of people who are watching consistently and saying, oh, well, did Family Research Council edit its page to take down the SPLC's hate group accusation? Yes, let's put it back up. And they'll get to it in seconds.
Well, that's all the time we have for our panel. We thank everyone who joined us here at the center, and also those of you who joined us online for this great panel. Thank you, Tyler, so much for writing the book, for joining us today. I think it's a really important book, Making Hate Pay, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center. General Boykin, thank you so much for joining us and all the work that you've done on this topic.
Yeah,
Great
thank you
book.
both.
Thank you.